the king should order him to go and make himself available to all investigating authorities. I feel like the royal family are edging nearer to that position. But if they don't do that, there's always going to be this terrible stench of them being part of the cover-up.
Welcome back. I'm speaking to Piers Morgan, the transatlantic now media star. Now, you are complaining that you've been misquoted on social media with your views on the Epstein trials and the imprisonment of Ghislaine Maxwell. That's right?
Well, not just misquoted. They had a big piece in the Telegraph yesterday. And I like the Telegraph. I read it every day. My wife works for it as a columnist. But I read this piece, and they'd asked me about the meeting I had with Ghislaine Maxwell at a book launch in, I think it was 2013, where I had a 5-minute conversation with her. I'd never met her. We talked exclusively about her father, Robert Maxwell, who, of course, had owned the Daily Mirror. And I never met any of the Maxwells, so I was curious to talk to her about her father for a few minutes. And they asked me about that. I said, look, as I wrote at the time in my diary for the Mail, I found her very charming, very friendly, very nice. I saw nothing of this incredibly dark, horrific, nefarious side to her that was clearly the reality of her relationship with Epstein. And then, to my astonishment and horror, the Telegraph then ran into another quote saying, I believe she's been made a scapegoat and shouldn't be in prison. And then they gave a damning last paragraph about how disgraceful this belief was of mine and what an insult it was to the survivors, which I would totally concur with had I ever said it. In fact, as they've now conceded in an apology that's online and will be in the paper on Monday, they didn't do it in the online version. They just did it in the print version. Anyway, to their credit, they have immediately thrown their hands up, conceded what happened, and apologised.
Right,
But the problem is that people will have read the paper and they will believe that's what I actually think, and they will have seen me be judged accordingly, which is a shame, because it's obviously the opposite of what I think.
All right, but let's just clarify this. You think she deserves to be in prison?
100%, yeah. I mean, I've been hammering at Ghislaine Maxwell and Epstein on my show now for years.
But yeah. It is possible that she's the scapegoat in the sense that very few of the powerful Americans associated with Epstein have faced many consequences.
Well, it does. I don't think it makes her a scapegoat. She's still just as culpable and guilty as she was indeed convicted of being culpable and guilty, of being effectively his fixer and madame, who was, I think, the direct conduit for so many of these young female victims to come under the clutches of Epstein, who was a convicted paedophile. So I'm very clear about her culpability and guilt. I certainly think it's extraordinary that whereas in the UK we're seeing some of the highest figures in public life from the royal family and from politics brought down by these ongoing revelations in the Epstein files, we're not seeing the same thing happening in America with high-profile people. You're seeing people on a kind of second tier who are losing jobs and stuff, but they're not really largely well known. But, you know, there's no accountability at the level in America that we're seeing in the UK, and that has to change.
And there's still this interest in America in, you know, hearing from former Prince Andrew, for example, in hearings. Would that serve any other purpose other than, you know, media sensation?
Yeah, I think this is incredibly damaging to the monarchy and to the royal family, incredibly damaging. You're now seeing that every time King Charles is out on a walkabout, or William has gone to Saudi Arabia, or Prince Edward obviously was over in the Middle East as well, all they're doing is either having people shout at them about the scandal or asking direct questions about the scandal. And I think the heat is building, and I don't think the conventional royal response of don't say very much and hope it blows over is going to wash this time. You know, you've got Andrew, who is, I think he remains 8th in line to the throne, although obviously he'd never be king. But you have him still on that ladder, a very high-ranking member of the royal family at the centre of the biggest political and royal scandal of my lifetime. And the one thing Andrew has always said, he wanted to clear his name in court. And at the last minute in the action brought against him by Virginia Giuffre, he settled for a reported £12 million. And so he's never had his day in court. He's never cleared his name. More and more revelations have come out, including now about his behavior as trade envoy, where he appears to have been leaking top secret information to business associates, including Epstein in America. So he needs to get in front of the investigators in America and be interrogated under oath until they are satisfied that he's given them everything that they need to have. He also should be investigated by the British police and indeed what was going on at Buckingham Palace with the comings and goings of these women, in the same way that Mandelson should also be, as he is being investigated by British police and in front of Congress in America. But, these are very serious figures in a very serious scandal who should be brought to book and put in front of people under oath who are investigating this scandal and be made to say what they actually know.
Do you think it would be better or worse for the king, for his brother to be exposed to the full force of the law on both sides of the Atlantic?
I think it would be better. It would clear the air once and for all about what Andrew did or didn't do. There's nothing more sobering for people than to be under oath with a penalty of perjury and years imprisonment if you lie. I think if you're King Charles, at the moment you're in a very, very difficult position where it looks like you're part of the cover-up. You are putting your brother up in, one of the royal estates in a very nice new, albeit not quite as luxurious home, but still very luxurious, with staff paying for you, and he's not doing a day's work. He's just having everything paid for him. And I don't think people like that. And I think that the king should order him to go and make himself available to all investigating authorities. I feel like the royal family are edging nearer to that position. But if they don't do that, there's always going to be this terrible stench of them being part of the cover-up, as indeed there is, very sadly, against his mother, the late great Queen, who obviously sanctioned the payment to pay off Virginia Giuffre. That looks more and more now like a poor error of judgment by the royal family and the monarchy as an institution, because we now know that a lot of what Virginia Giuffre was saying was true, not least the veracity of that picture of her with Andrew, which he's always denied, which we now know from emails in the Epstein files from Ghislaine Maxwell